We're here to listen to Fintan O'Toole talk about his new book, The Politics of Pain, Post-War England and the Rise of Nationalism. An award-winning writer for the Irish Times, The Guardian, and the New York Review of Books, O'Toole, author of books including Judging Shaw, is one of the sharpest critics of literature, drama, and politics now working. His new book is a profound, yet also darkly funny, portrait of England that seeks to explain the country's nationalist trends by looking back to the end of World War II. While the British won that war, they also lost the empire and ceded the next century to the Americans. And O'Toole views this as the root cause for Brexit and a host of today's cultural idiosyncrasies. Here to talk more about it, please help me welcome Fintan O'Toole.
Good evening, everybody. Lovely to see you. Thank you very much for coming. We're here really this evening to just indulge in an orgy of self-pity, because in a sense, what one has to try to explain in relation to Brexit is this fundamental question of how does a successful, privileged, prosperous Western European democracy begin to imagine itself as being intolerably oppressed and therefore in need of a moment of national liberation. And it's that mechanism really that I'm going to try to talk about and that I tried to write about in this book. The process of Brexit is really not one that anybody can write a book about because we don't know where it's going or if it's going anywhere indeed, if it has an ending. The phrase that's now current is Brexternity, which is, I think, pretty good one. And it seems like Donald Tusk, who's the president or the outgoing president of the European Council, said there was a special place in hell for those who had created Brexit without having a plan for how to execute it. And I think there is, but it's maybe a special time in hell. It's a strange kind of time where the thing seems to speed up. There's a new drama every week, and at the same time seems not to change at all. I mean, effectively, we're still in exactly the same condition that we were on June 24th, 2016, when the results of the referendum came in. So I'm not really interested in talking about that day-to-day process of drama. That's the stuff of journalism, day-to-day journalism, which I do, and I write about it, on a regular basis. But in terms of writing a book about it, I did think what was more interesting really was to try to answer those larger questions as to how do you get there? Why does a country which is in very many ways an admirable and greatly admired country create for itself this crisis? It's an unusual crisis because in that it's entirely self-generated. Right? So usually when countries find themselves in a situation where their political institutions and their habits of mind and their sense of social solidarity is falling apart, it's because of some huge external pressure or some terrible economic crisis or war or invasion. This is an entirely self-generated crisis, and that's why I think we have to ask what's driving it and what are the more profound aspects of this. So this is where self-pity really does come into play. I'm sure political scientists would say self-pity is not a valid tool for political analysis, but I think the entire country and Western music industry would disagree with that. Self-pity is a very interesting emotion because it has no objective correlative, right? Self-pity is entirely about what you think you deserve and what you're getting. And what you think you deserve, of course, is entirely subjective, right? And based on your own experience. If you always fly first class, and then, you find yourself suddenly, down at the back of the plane. It's a horrible experience of humiliation, and, and you're seething with anger, and you feel that, you've been disrespected in a fundamental way. Whereas if you usually, ride at the back of the plane and you just get sort of halfway up, you feel, oh, this is wonderful. It's really, so one's sense of self-worth is not necessarily capable of objective measurement. It's very much to do with this notion of what do you deserve. And collectively, with England, and I am going to talk about England rather than the United Kingdom or Britain. So I don't know if you saw Donald Trump rambling about this a while ago, saying, Britain, what do they call them? Why do they call England? I just like to call it England, and I think actually for once there was something kind of right about that. At least in relation to Brexit. Brexit is an English phenomenon primarily, right? So Scotland overwhelmingly voted against it. Northern Ireland voted against it. Wales is complicated because there's an English Wales and a Welsh Wales. Welsh Wales voted against it and English Wales voted for it by and large. But really, it's what you might call England without London. If you take out the big metropolitan, multicultural cities, it's that deep England that's where the Brexit votes are. That's where this thing happened. And so we need to think about England and its experience, really since the end of the Second World War. And what I try to suggest is that there are two very obvious things, right? So I'm not claiming any prizes for suggesting that you've got to think about the Second World War and you've got to think about empire, right? That's pretty obvious as large-scale factors. What I do think is interesting is how the legacy of those two things actually plays out and feeds into this moment of Brexit, right? Because it's not in ways that are straightforward, but rather you get a kind of turning upside down of what you would think might be the experience of the Second World War and empire. So to just talk about the Second World War for a moment. To be fair, right? So, it's sometimes we scratch our heads in wonder at what England has done. There is something that happened to England that I don't think has ever happened to any other country in history, which is that it's the victor in an absolutely major conflict. I mean, arguably the major conflict, Second World War. Not on its own. I think America might have had something to do with it, and the Soviet Union and other people. But nevertheless, genuinely, if Britain doesn't stand out in 1939, 1940, particularly 1940, against fascism, the history of Europe is fundamentally different, and it is a heroic moment. And of course, it continues, the UK, Britain is a major part of the Allied war effort. And within 10 years, the three Axis powers, the very powers that were defeated, each one of them is doing much better than Britain is. I don't think there's a parallel to that experience, that Germany, Italy, and Japan, the three Axis powers who were defeated, are booming economically. They're undergoing these extraordinary economic resurrections, while Britain is economically stuck and is also losing empire at the same time. Right? So I think that is a unique historic experience, and I think it does produce a sense of not getting what one thought one deserved. Britain had good reason to expect to be a world power in the aftermath of the Second World War. And what's happening instead is that its position in the world is gradually eroding. And I think, in fairness, we have to acknowledge that this is not something that anybody else has really had to cope with in the same sort of way. And as I mentioned, then the parallel thing that's going on, and remember these are completely intertwined, is the loss of empire, right? So you've had a relatively small country, an island, which, has dominated the lives of a quarter of the entire world's population. It's one of the greatest empires in human history, but it's certainly one of the most disproportionate. The degree to which Britain rose to empire and sustained empire, in spite, for example, of the loss of America. Was able to compensate by gaining India. So it's an enterprise which continues over centuries and is remarkably successful in its own terms. So these two things are happening. And the question really is, what deep effects do they have mentally? What kind of collective psychology do they tend to create? There are plenty of seats, by the way, if anybody wants to sit down, feel free. There's no bother at all. So what happens, I would suggest, is that both of these things get turned upside down and inside out. Right? So it's not that there's a straight, simple sense of, well, we won the Second World War, we didn't get what we deserved, and we lost an empire, and we feel sorry for ourselves. I think it's more complex and more interesting than that. The mechanisms that are at work are rather more remarkable. In terms of the Second World War, one of the mechanisms that becomes possible, right, is that in a certain kind of dark corner of the reactionary imagination, you can start to think, if we didn't get what we deserved out of winning the war, maybe in a sense we didn't win the war. Maybe we actually lost the war. Maybe we were defeated in the long run. We beat the Germans twice on the battlefield in the 20th century, but they beat us in the end by constructing this mechanism, this trap, this economic ground on which they could fight us. They couldn't fight us militarily, but they could fight us economically. And this is very directly stated by English conservative politicians. Particularly, it starts to become a way of thinking around the time of German reunification. So, the fall of the Berlin Wall, German reunification, 1990, 1991, that kind of period is when you get a resurrection of this strange way of imagining the Second World War as, in fact, a defeat. It's interesting just to think about one thing, what image we don't have in our heads and that you would think we ought to have in our heads. I mean, think about the fall of the Berlin Wall. Think about the ceremonies around all of that. Think of the moments of German reunification. Where's Margaret Thatcher? Where's the British Prime Minister? You would think logically Britain would have been able to go there and claim, and absolutely reasonably, this is the final defeat of fascism and communism. We as a country have really good reason to feel very proud of the role we've played in this. We're part of this story, and we're embracing it and we're claiming it, as something that we recognize and celebrate. Why is Thatcher not there? She's not there because, this is, people think I'm making this up, but it's in Charles Moore's authorized biography of Thatcher. At that time, she used to carry around in that famous handbag of hers, she carried a map of the Nazi advances across Europe in 1939, 1940. She's becoming obsessed with this notion that, they're back, that the German reunification is recreating this terrible power at the heart of Europe. And the very celebration of German reunification can be taken in this kind of very dark, strange way as evidence of British defeat. We didn't really win. You start to get then, around this time, you start to get a strange genre of fiction which also becomes TV series and movies, which is sort of counterfactual thrillers in which, in fact, Britain was defeated in 1940. Britain surrendered so they didn't get the troops out of Dunkirk. They surrendered and now they're part of the Reich. Or after Dunkirk, the German invasion, so they didn't get the troops home. The homeland was undefended and the German invasion worked and they take over. And so you have these novels which are kind of set in a counterfactual parallel universe of a Nazified Britain. And these are very successful. I mean, these are real bestsellers. Right? It's not an obscure genre. Right? These are million-selling books. Len Deighton's SSGB, which is from the late 1980s, but interestingly was made into a TV series just in the run-up to Brexit. You know, has literally Nazis on the streets of London, and you know, and the English resistance having to form itself in the way that the French resistance did. And there's about a dozen of these very successful books. Probably the most successful and in a way the most interesting of them is Robert Harris's Fatherland, which was a huge seller. It's a brilliant thriller. I mean, just to read it as a thriller, it's really superbly written and very engaging. And in a way, it's more subtly disturbing than Len Deighton's book SSGB is. In SSGB, the Nazis invade, they take over, and that's the setting. Whereas in Fatherland, it's in a way it's even more humiliating, which is that Britain sort of surrendered at the time of just after Dunkirk has failed, and now it's a sort of semi-detached part of the Reich. It doesn't really matter that much, you know. The Nazis didn't even have to bother invading, you know. It's very, very clever, and you get these snippets. So the novel's actually set in Germany, right? So the hero of the novel is a German detective. It's a detective story, but subtly you keep getting these kind of hints of, you know, Britain over there. The German newspapers, for example, we read, carry ads for French perfume, Italian silks, Scandinavian furs, Dutch cigars, Belgian coffee, Russian caviar, British televisions. The cornucopia of empire spilled across the pages. And of course, the empire is the Reich, you know. Little bits of news come in. Quote, Herbert von Karajan to conduct a special performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the European Anthem, which of course it is the European Union anthem, at the Royal Albert Hall in London on the Führer's birthday. In London, it had been announced that King Edward and Queen Wallis, of course, you know, Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson have been put back on the throne, were to pay a state visit to the Reich in July, further to strengthen the deep bonds of respect and affection between the peoples of Great Britain and the German Reich. But the real twist in it is that the German Reich actually, so this is written by, you know, very explicitly written in 1990 and very explicitly written in response to German reunification. So Robert Harris has a new introduction to a later edition in which he writes about why he wrote the book. You know, there's all this fear of this new Germany. But as the hero is kind of walking through Berlin, at one point he passes by the European Parliament building, and you know it has the flags of the European nations surmounted by the swastika. You know, and it's explained now that England is now part of the European Union, which has been established by the Nazis. In the West, 12 nations. At the time, of course, in 1990, there were 12 members of the European Union. 12 nations, Portugal, Spain, France, Ireland, Great Britain, Belgium, Holland, Italy, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, had been corralled by Germany under the Treaty of Rome into a European trading bloc. German was the official second language in all schools. People drove German cars, listened to German radios, watched German televisions. worked in German-owned factories, moaned about the behavior of German tourists in German-dominated holiday resorts, while German teams won every international sporting competition except cricket, which only the English played. So you have this this fantasy, really fantasy of defeat, and it's you may think, okay, come on, you're pushing it to say that this has anything to do with Brexit, right? How does this feed into Brexit? Well, it feeds into, well, we'll come back to the empire thing because that's also going to be part of it. But one way it feeds in very directly into, I was going to say the strategy, the negotiating strategy, but that's probably slightly over complimentary to suggest that there was a strategy. Here we are 3 years later. But I don't know if any of you remember the extraordinary image of the first day of negotiations in Brussels on the withdrawal treaty of Britain from the European Union. And it's an extraordinary image because you have, on one side of the table, you've got Michel Barnier, the European Union negotiator, French, which is nearly as bad as being German, and Sabine Weyand, who is German. And they're sitting on one side of the table, and they have, piles of documents and files, and they have computers, and and David Davis, who is the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, is kind of sitting there with not a single piece of paper. It's just sitting there looking at them. Isn't this nice? Why? Why is this not taken seriously? And it's not taken seriously because, of course, the European Union is not real. It's just the Germans. It's a German front. This is David Davis just before the referendum. He says, and I quote, "The first calling point of the UK negotiator in the time immediately after Brexit will not be Brussels, it will be Berlin to strike a deal. Absolute access for German cars and industrial goods in exchange for a sensible deal on everything else." And a year after the referendum, when he in fact was that negotiator, Davis was on the BBC. Andrew Marr asked him, he said, "You basically argued that the German car industry and German industry generally would put pressure on the German Chancellor, who would put pressure on the EU to ensure that we got a good deal. Is that still your view?" "Oh," replied Davis, "yeah, that's where it will end up." So you can't really understand the stasis of negotiations without understanding this idea that really the European Union is just the Germans. And really, therefore, this thing will come down to a familiar test of character between the Brits and the Germans. And the Brits always win, We'll win this one again if we hold our nerve. This concept of holding our nerve against the Germans is a key part of why Britain finds it so difficult to actually negotiate. The idea of the last moment, and the last moment being in Berlin, is really kind of crucial to all of this. So this is one side of this mentality. It's this idea that of defeat of the European Union, therefore being a kind of purely German construct, and of therefore the need for an English equivalent to the French resistance. This sort of hyped up idea that by leaving the European Union, it's a national revolution against this oppressive force. It's not the only version of it. Just in case you think they're short of hyping up the sense of oppression. I mean, Boris Johnson did compare the European Union to Hitler. But Jeremy Hunt, who was the supposedly moderate alternative to Boris Johnson in the Tory party leadership race, he simply said it was like Stalin, so you can take your pick, really. But the German one has much more purchase on the imagination, I think, for all the reasons we've been talking about. So that's one side of this strange mental construct. The other side of it is empire, of course, and is what happens in a post-imperial culture. There's a way of talking about this, which I think is not that useful, right? Which is about nostalgia for empire. And I don't think it's that simple. I don't think the vast majority of people who voted for Brexit, think the empire is coming back. They're not stupid. But I think there are two legacies of empire, which are interrelated and that are very important in feeding into what happens with Brexit. One of these is a mindset, right, which is a binary mindset. And in empire, there are only two possible states that you can be in. You are either dominant or you're submissive. You're either the imperial power or you are being colonized. There's nothing in between, really, when it comes down to it. And it's that binary which remains and which makes Britain's relationship with the European Union so difficult. Right? Because if you see the world through that binary, you ask the question, right, which is, what's going on in the European Union? Well, the European Union, you may like it, you may not like it, but it is constructed. One of the reasons why it's so slow and so tedious is it's constructed to make sure that there is no dominant power. Nobody can dominate. That's why it exists, primarily to stop the Germans from dominating Europe ever again. And the Germans, of course, understanding how self-destructive their own domination had been, are a very willing partner in this. In fact, they want to be shackled in some way by the European Union. But this leads to a kind of notion that each member state enjoys a kind of normality and a kind of equality. Well, where does that fit if your binary mindset is that you're either dominant or submissive? I do make the point in the book, and I was hoping to get a little bit of the S&M market out of this, that the biggest selling English book, of course, in the run-up to Brexit is 50 Shades of Grey, which is all about domination and submission. So, the main characters are referred to as the dominant and the submissive. They're capital D, capital S. This may be purely coincidental, or maybe not. But the interesting thing here is, right, that you ask the question: are we dominating this European Union? And you say, well, patently we're not. Therefore, the only other possibility is that it is dominating us. The idea of a consensual normality, just getting on with being one of 28, is fundamentally problematic within that mindset. And I think that's one of the ghosts of empire, right? Is that mentality that continues. But the other side of this is a certain kind of idea of pain. I would suggest that the last zombie stage of empire is when you've taken everything else from the people that you dominated. You take their pain. You take the idea that, there's a certain kind of romance or glamour in being oppressed, in being the victim. It gives you a story. Because it also, of course, implies that you can rise again. You can rise out of it. You can have a moment of national liberation. When this book came out in Britain, it's called Heroic Failure is the title. Because I was very interested in this. There's a very specific structure of feeling, we might call it, within English culture, which is heroic failure. It's a rather extraordinary construct. If you go up the Mall, which is the great processional avenue leading up to Buckingham Palace in London, over on the right-hand side, there's a square which has monuments, and you look at the monuments, and you realize every single one of the monuments is to a great screw-up. It's the charge of the Light Brigade. When these poor unfortunate fellows were rode in the wrong direction and charged the Russian cannons and got butchered. It's Scott of the Antarctic who didn't get to the Antarctic and died. it's Gordon of Khartoum, who was butchered with all his men. Lord Franklin, who went to find the Northwest Passage and didn't find it, and lost all his men in an act of complete naval incompetence. I particularly like Lord Franklin because in Franklin's case, not only did Franklin screw up and lose, poor unfortunate sailors, but they kept sending other expeditions to try to find Franklin, and then those expeditions would have to be rescued in their turn, and it just went on for decades. It's a really wonderful example of this idea of heroic failure. What's going on there? Why does, because remember this arrives at a time when Britain is the dominant power in the world. It's at the very height of the functioning of empire. And of course, if you think about it, it's a rather brilliant way of deflecting the brutality of empire, right? Because what it says is what we celebrate is not our successes and our triumphs. We say, oh, the real us, the real English character comes out at these moments of failure, at these moments of disaster. Think about this. One of the tropes that keeps coming up again and again and again in Brexit discourse is the Dunkirk spirit, right? Churchill, after Dunkirk, Churchill was saying, what? Are people celebrating a major military defeat and a retreat? Is that how we're going to win the war? Churchill was puzzled by the cult of Dunkirk that's kind of started so quickly. There are very, very few other societies, other big power societies that sort of celebrate something like a successful retreat is the greatest thing we can think of. But in the imperial context, it was actually very powerful because what it said was really two things. You think, you subject people, you think you suffer, but we suffer much more than you do. Look at all the pain we go through. To bring you enlightenment and to explore the world and to conquer things. It's very tough being the imperial power. And the second important thing is, and we don't cry about it. We don't complain. So the absolute core of this cult of heroic failure is the sort of the playing fields of Eton. It's a masculinist, very much, of course, tied up with an upper class male privileged notion of what it is to be a man. And what it is to be a man is, England's favorite poem is Rudyard Kipling's If, to look disaster and triumph in the face and realize they're just the same thing. None of it matters. We rise above all of this. And in doing so, of course, that's where we prove our superiority to less fortunate people, more benighted, ignorant, savage people, Because what do they do? What do the Irish do? They complain, they whinge about, being oppressed. What do women do? They cry and they faint, But the English upper class male, proves the superiority by the lack of self-pity. What's fascinating is that with Brexit, which is, the great resurrection of this cult of heroic failure, it's the great disaster being created, but it has a sort of postmodern twist, right? Which is that you add in the very thing that it was meant not to have, which is self-pity, right? So what you do is you hype up. So instead of playing down the suffering, it's playing down the idea that, yes, I'm just about to be butchered by people, but I'm still, a good Englishman, it's fine. It turns it on its head. It turns the whole cult into the opposite of what it was supposed to be. Heroic failure becomes a sort of indulgence in an idea that you are intolerably oppressed, that you take very minor things and you make them into utterly outrageous examples of the humiliation of Britain and of England in particular. You can't understand Brexit without understanding in a way that it's a kind of camp parodic version of this 19th century, early 20th century tradition of heroic failure. And the camping is done to a very large extent by Boris Johnson. And Johnson, it's kind of right that he should end up as prime minister, because he's in many ways the originator of a lot of this stuff. Rather brilliantly, Johnson had a really extraordinary achievement early in his career. I mean, he did something which is really quite hard to do, which is to get fired for lying. You know, most journalists lie and don't get fired for it. But in his first job, he got a job straight out of university, straight out of Oxford, you know, in that sort of class system, taken into the London Times, given a graduate special kind of internship position that was going to lead to a job. And he screwed it up by just making stuff up, right? So he couldn't be bothered to really write much about the truth and just start making stuff up, and got caught and got fired, and was immediately hired by the Daily Telegraph, which is the mainstream conservative newspaper, and sent to Brussels. You know, why? Because Brussels was a thing you could lie about with absolute impunity. You know, and there was a sense that actually this guy's really good at this stuff. You know, the lies are really good; they're really fun. But Johnson's mode, the mode he discovers in Brussels, is a mode of camped up outrage. You know, find something absolutely trivial. A key phrase in Johnson's output is, "This is not as trivial as it sounds." You know, even though it is entirely trivial, you find a way of making it seem like this is do or die, a matter of national pride. We really have to take our stand here. So some of you may remember Johnson had said when he, you know, in his campaign to become prime minister, he said he would die in a ditch rather than seek another extension to the period allowed for the withdrawal agreement beyond October 31st, which makes him, of course, officially the first member of the undead to occupy number 10 Downing Street. Maybe not in reality, but officially. But as it happens, in the book, I had used a passage from him where he uses exactly the same phrase about dying in a ditch. And it was in 2002. And it was about dying in a ditch to save the prawn cocktail flavored crisp. Crisp is a potato chip, from the interference of Brussels bureaucrats, you know, as a matter of national salvation, you know. And he was brilliant at doing this, right? So just to give you this example, there is a rule which I think most of us would probably approve of, which says if you're making potato products, they must be mostly made of potato. You can't add lots of other stuff. And Johnson kind of hits on it. It's really boring stuff, right? So if you're a journalist and you're in Brussels, you get on page 15 if you're lucky, right? How do you get on page 1? Well, you get on page 1 by saying, some Nazi in Brussels is trying to stop us feeding our children whatever kind of, you know, exotic flavored potato chips we want. And we have, and he uses the word heritage, we have an English heritage of exotic flavored potato chips, and I will die in a ditch to fight this, you know, oppression. Now, is this serious? Is it a joke? Well, it's a brilliant construct, right? Because it's in the middle entirely, where it's everybody loves the game because it feeds into all sorts of pre-existing prejudices, right? Brussels is this sort of horrible, oppressive machine. And what he kind of does is it's like a Monty Python sketch, you know, where you invent this sort of surreal world where you have people sitting around all day just thinking, what could we do to really annoy the Brits? Like, what, you know, what could we really humiliate them? Oh, let's stop them eating whatever kind of crisps they want. And then this becomes a whole genre of journalism, right? So the entire British press corps, not the entire one, but most of them, spend their time in Brussels trying to kind of outdo each other. You find a regulation and make it completely absurd, you know, push it into some realm of Python-esque humor, which also sounds like it's intolerable oppression, right? So, for example, I don't know about most of you, but I tend to like my sandwiches without human hair in them, you know, it's just maybe a quirk of mine, but this was obviously shared by, these horrible bureaucrats in the European Union. So there's a regulation saying if you're processing fresh food, you must wear a hairnet, to stop your hair falling into the food. Not very exciting, and most people probably approve of it. How do you make that into an issue of national humiliation? So, food processing would probably include our gallant English hairy-chested fishermen out on the North Sea, fishing for cod. They're being made to wear hairnets while they're fishing. Well, no, they're not, of course, Or Brussels is bringing in regulation-sized condoms, which of course would be much too small for English men, Or they're bringing in a regulation banning donkey rides on beaches. Or, there's a regulation which is animal welfare legislation, right? For example, saying if you're transporting live cattle for more than, 500 kilometers or whatever, you must give them a break. You can't just keep them in a hot, container at the back, and you have to stop and get them water. Just as a basic kind of humane legislation. The British tabloid press makes this, so they're saying all animals being transported across state lines have to be fed and watered, including shrimp. And it's brilliant. It's wonderful. I mean, it's pure. The English sense of humor is at work in this. It's like think up the most outlandish extrapolation from a very ordinary, dull piece of legislation you can possibly find, right? But the effect of this over 30 years is to give substance to this idea of tyranny and oppression. So it becomes rooted in all of these crazy absurdities. And it's actually oddly effective. So the funnier it is and the more outlandish it is, the more it lodges in people's heads, as a kind of reality. And what its paradox then is that it's both very, very effective in undermining British allegiance towards the European Union and completely useless when you do Brexit, right? So in a way, Brexit is a sort of authentic national revolution. I mean, it's an English national revolution, not a UK one. But the thing with revolutions is you're supposed to be able to do something. It might be a bad thing. Maybe you shoot the kulaks, or maybe you hang the priest, or you redistribute land. You do something, right? It has an outcome which is tangible for those who support it in the immediate term. The problem is that you can't, bring prawn cocktail flavored crisps back into the shops because they were never not in the shops. You can't unban donkey rides because there were always donkey rides. You can't stop the poor fishermen from being humiliated by having to wear hairnets because they never did. Because it's fictional. It's actually very hard to give it substance. What is it you're actually going to do? And this becomes essentially the problem of Brexit, right? Which is that it has enormous emotional weight. It's come through this kind of very deep structure of unresolved relationships with the Second World War and with empire. It, of course, only happens because you have very deep unhappiness in many parts of England about other things, about austerity, about poverty, about marginalization. So it has all these kind of very powerful things driving it, but where can they drive it? The only place to drive it is off a cliff, really. The only place that you can really take it is towards self-harm and towards a sense that, you do it for its own sake. And finally, where it ends up with is, so if you're kind of claiming this pain of oppression, there's a certain kind of logic that the narrative of this will change over time. The initial narrative of Brexit is it's going to be incredibly easy and it's going to be fantastic. David Davis says this is going to be the easiest trade deal ever done in world history. The promise is, of course, for the voters, you will have all the benefits of membership of the European Union without being in the European Union. It's like you can play tennis every time you like on the tennis courts and you don't have to be in the tennis club. It's an improbable promise. But the fundamental difficulty with it is that you cannot ultimately liberate yourself from imaginary oppression. And I think that's why this project has found it very, very difficult to go anywhere. So what's it left with finally? The narrative has changed from this is going to be fantastic to this is absolute torture. Let's get it over with. A sort of the ultimate heroic failure idea, which is let's embrace the pain. Boris Johnson's now running on, an election campaign on the basis of get Brexit done, which is, make it stop. I know this is awful. I know you can't bear it anymore, but let's make it stop. And the alternative version is Nigel Farage, who's running, trying to run even to the right of Boris Johnson on let's embrace the pain. Let's do no deal Brexit. Let's crash out. Let's kind of bring it all down. And somehow in that pain, we will discover our true character. We will be really British again. Neither of these, I think, has long-term viability. And this is why the thing is stuck in Brexiternity. Thank you very much indeed. I've gone on longer than I should, so we've about 10 minutes for questions, and I'm very happy to take them. Yes, please. I think they'd like you to go to the microphone if you don't mind, because I think they're podcasting it or recording it, so thank you.
I'm just wondering, the whole idea of Brexit being a product of World War II issues and empire, which is all very reasonable. But, Brexit seems to have been pushed. The voices of it are Boris Johnson, Farage, Rees-Mogg, who are elites who have done really well, who are not suffering economically. The people who voted for it are the largely, or one big voting bloc for Brexit were the people in the north who are suffering economically. But I'm just wondering, was all those things that you were talking about, this idea of we're not an empire, Germany, we should be better than Germany or whatever, are those ideas things that the working class have been building among the working class and that the politicians are reacting to? Or are the politicians manufacturing this stuff and pushing it on those people? I'm just trying to understand the class stuff.
Yeah, it's a terrific question, I think. And I think it's a bit of both, So I think you put your finger really on one of the big questions that has to be answered, which is how do you get this alliance between this sort of decadent post-imperial ruling class, right? It's decadent because there's no empire to rule anymore, and it therefore becomes anarchic. So a lot of the energy in this with Johnson particularly, it's a completely anarchic energy. It's the energy of just kind of screwing everything up, throwing it all up in the air. It's kind of narcissistic pleasure. And I think that is shared by a certain kind of working class culture. One of the things I deal with in the book, which I didn't really talk about, is punk. The great English cultural movement, of the last 35 years is punk. And punk is a working class version of that, right? I'm just kind of saying, so you've those who no longer really care because they're, an anarchic ruling elite. And you've got people underneath who have nothing to lose, or feel they have nothing to lose, but who the pleasure then of screwing everything up and of kicking everything and of spitting on everything, is very powerful as well. So these two things do meet, I think. And this structure in the middle of particularly this idea that, we're English, we deserve better, I think is real. And then it's very cleverly manipulated from the top. And of course, this alliance, it's very similar in many ways to what's happening with Trump, but the alliance is brilliant for negative purposes. It's great at pulling things down. It's when you start saying, well, what do you want to build after that, of course, those two interests diverge very rapidly. So at the top, the Rees-Moggs of this world, Rees-Mogg is a hedge fund manager, for God's sake. Rees-Mogg actually moved one of his hedge funds to Dublin And they sent out emails to the holders of the fund saying, we're moving to avoid the effects of Brexit. I mean, the cynicism is astonishing, of these people who are going to make a lot of money out of this stuff. Their interests are absolutely not the interests of the people you're talking about, who are the kind of working class voters in the Midlands and the north of England. This is why this election is going to be very interesting, because Johnson is betting on the idea that he can repeat the trick. That he can get exactly those working class Labour voters to vote for Brexit rather than thinking about the National Health Service or unemployment or poverty or any other question. And we'll see how that goes. So thank you.
So I was born in South London of Irish parents, where I lived for the first few years of my life before happily going to Ireland. And I've been a student of England, obviously, ever since, because of its curious nature and eccentricities. And I have to compliment you on your writing about this, because I think you've more profoundly really dug deep into kind of the etiology of what we've been seeing, and reflecting on it. It seems that with your detached perspective, is that there's a profound delusional psychosis that's present, and that there's an astonishing lack of awareness of this. And you mentioned about the unique position of England after the war. And I think it seems that it's possible that this is a unique phenomenon, this kind of psychosis. And given its roots, going back to empire and the war and all that, one has to wonder, what's the prognosis here? I mean, there's the election and there's all this short-term, kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the prognosis must be kind of guarded.
Yes. Thank you very much. Beautifully put. I think you raise a very interesting question, right? Which is Englishness, right? So hovering over all of this stuff, right? None of this. So all of these things are there. So, but there's lots of stuff is in the groundwater politically in different countries, and it doesn't necessarily emerge to the surface, right? Something else has to happen. Clearly, one of the things is the austerity, 10 years of austerity. The undermining of the welfare state. All of that sort of is a huge factor in it. But the other one is the re-emergence of English nationalism, right? So it's a remarkable development. The English, if you go back to Shakespeare's time, for example, before a Scottish king takes the throne in 1603 in London, Shakespeare, I don't think ever uses the word Britain, or almost never. It doesn't, he's not interested in Britain. He writes about England. He's an English playwright. This is English history. It's what he's interested in. After 1603, James, come down from Scotland, wants to be King of England, is King of England, wants to unite Scotland and England. Shakespeare starts writing about Britain. The word Britain, British, starts coming into Shakespeare, which tells you that Britishness has to be constructed. It has to be created, and the English don't like it for a very long time. They really hate the Scots very deeply, and are not interested in this sort of dilution of Englishness. What makes it work is, of course, empire, right? So the deal is, if you're going to build a global empire, you can't have bloody Scots invading you from the north every time you go off and invade somebody else, right? You have to have control over and peace on your own island. So the deal is, the Scots get a bit of the empire and the English get peace on the island, which allows them to create and sustain it. So Englishness gets folded into Britishness and into empire, right? Those are two other constructs. And that's the deal. It's one of the oldest, most powerful national identities on the planet, but it's willing to submerge itself in these other constructs. What happens? Well, empire is gone, so one of the constructs is gone, and then Britishness starts to erode very rapidly in the late 1990s, right? So you get the Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, which says Northern Ireland can go anytime it wants, 50% plus one, and it's gone. And then you get the following year, you got the establishment of the Scottish and Welsh parliaments, right? And not unreasonably, the English start saying, well, what about us? Who are we? What's our political identity? Why don't we have a right to be a political community as well? It's not an unreasonable question. The problem, and I think you put your finger on it, is that it becomes psychotic because it's given no positive self-definition. Right? There's no political party, there's no newspapers, there's no national theatre, there's no W.B. Yeats. It doesn't have all that kind of hinterland of nationalism really around it that can contain nationalism and give it a sense of purpose. So this is why I think it falls back on this self-pitying narrative. And I think what's implied in your question is, once you unleash those things, can you ever get them back in the bottle? And I think this is the real question. It seems to me whatever happens with Brexit, Brexit may still not happen. If Johnson doesn't get a majority and you have another hung parliament, they're going to have to eventually go back to the people. I don't see what else they can do. And the people may say, actually, we've had a look at Brexit now. We don't really like it. Thank you very much. Possibly. But even if it doesn't happen, this stuff is in the groundwater, and it has come very, very much closer to the surface. And a parallel I would think about in American terms is, you think about lost causism in the South, for example. Brexit, if it doesn't happen, will always be a great lost cause. It always would have been wonderful if only it had been allowed. The only antidote to it, in my view, is a positive embrace of a progressive, socially egalitarian Englishness. And God knows they've got a lot of it. There's a lot of extraordinarily positive, tolerant, brilliant aspects to Englishness, which surely could also be embraced. But somebody's going to have to do it, and somebody's going to have to take it on. Brexit isn't going to solve the English question, and it's going to remain there. So the issue is, does it become a fetid thing that sort of rots away and keeps poison pumping into the system, or is it taken on in a sort of positive, progressive way? Thank you.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. My question is, can you speak a bit about the role of the media?
Yeah.
Would the Brexit vote be delayed had we not lived in the age of fake news or social media, or the whole disruption that is happening in the world of journalism and media?
Yes. It's a great question. Thank you very much. So Brexit is a media phenomenon to as much an extent as Trump is a media phenomenon, right? So just as you can't imagine Trumpism without The Apprentice, you can't imagine Brexit without the existence over a very long time of a kind of continual narrative that I talked about, in the press. It's not accidental that, Johnson has shifted from being a newspaper columnist to being a politician and back again when it suits him. Remember, he resigned as foreign secretary a year and a half ago to go back to his very well-paid job as a newspaper columnist. I'm a newspaper columnist. I'm not paid nearly as well as Boris Johnson. And if I was paid as well as him, I would have to keep producing outrage. What do you get paid for? I mean, who's going to pay you $1 million a year, which is what he was earning. Michael Gove, the two main figures in the Leave campaign, Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, are professional journalistic agitators. That's what they do and what they get paid for. Rupert Murdoch, of course, is a big figure in this. Murdoch despises the European Union. Why? He was asked about this once, and he explained in a very unusual moment of candor. He said, if I go into Downing Street and I demand something, I get what I want. If I go to Brussels, they don't know who I am. And that's why I hate the European Union. So absolutely, it's a media phenomenon. And then, exactly as you say, you have to remember that the Brexit, the actual referendum campaign, was used as a dry run for the Trump campaign, right? So this is June 2016. You're really, you're already kind of coming up towards the November election. You want to try out the techniques. So Steve Bannon is directly involved. The Mercers are involved. Cambridge Analytica, and Dominic Cummings, who is Johnson's dark guru, was running the Leave campaign absolutely up to his neck with all of these people. What he did was an extraordinary thing. It had never been done in a political campaign before, right? Which is he withheld 40% of the entire budget. So of all the money they had, they withheld 40% for the last 4 days and spent it all online. And they spent it all online using the stolen Facebook data to target individuals. So they literally sent out billions of targeted ads. So you opened up your computer and you were getting an ad which was using the data to figure out, well, you're actually quite a liberal person, so I'll go on something like the European Union is really bad at protecting the environment, or so, or we know that you're kind of attracted to anti-immigrant stuff, so I'm going to show you pictures of brown-skinned people trying to get into England. Very, very deliberate stuff. So, I mean, absolutely, these things are there, and they're very, very important factors in the way all of this was unleashed. And the extraordinary thing, just as in America, nothing's been done about it. We know these techniques now, and we know how they can distort democracy, and really no great defense has been put up by democratic institutions against them. But that's a whole other set of questions. Thank you very much indeed.